She freed over 300 people, went back into the most dangerous territory in America 13 times, and never lost a single soul. History gave her a nickname. They called her Moses. They said it was a compliment, a poetic comparison, a beautiful metaphor for a brave woman. But here's the question that no textbook ever asks. What if the people who called her that weren't reaching for poetry at all? What if they were reaching for the most precise, historically accurate word they could find? Because if the community Harriet Tubman was born into carried a documented identity rooted in the Exodus story, not borrowed, not adopted, but lived as their own, then Moses isn't a flattering nickname, it is a title, it is a lineage, it is history repeating itself, not as metaphor, but as flesh and bone. Stay with me, because what we're about to walk through is not speculation, it is documented, it is on record, and by the end of this video, the way you see Harriet Tubman will never be the same. Let's start with what you already know, or think you know. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross sometime around 1822 in a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. She was born into slavery, beaten, malnourished, and at around age 12 she suffered a traumatic head injury when an overseer threw a 2-pound lead weight at another enslaved person. It missed and struck Araminta instead. That injury would cause her narcoleptic seizures and intense visions for the rest of her life. She would later call those visions the voice of God. In 1849, at around age 27, she escaped, alone, on foot, 90 miles through swamps and forests and slaveholder territory, guided north by the stars and by a network of safe houses that history would name the Underground Railroad. She could have stayed free. She was in Philadelphia. She was safe. But she went back 13 times. 13 separate missions back into the most dangerous territory in the country. And she carried a revolver. According to documented accounts, she told every person she guided, "If you lose your nerve and turn back, I will shoot you," because a runaway who gets caught will be tortured until they give up every name they know. She never lost a single person. And it was William Still, a free black abolitionist and historian, who documented every person who came through his station on the Underground Railroad. It was Still who first wrote in his meticulous records that Tubman was operating like a general, like a prophet, like a liberator of an ancient kind. He called her Moses. Now here's where most videos stop. They say, and that's why she got the nickname Moses. But that's not the end of the story. That's barely the beginning. Because the question isn't what she did. The question is why the people around her, across different states, different decades, different religious backgrounds, all independently reached for the same name. Not freedom fighter, not the conductor, not the rescuer. Moses. So why that word? Why always that word? To understand why that name landed with such force, you have to understand the world Harriet Tubman was born into. The enslaved African community of antebellum America was deeply, profoundly, inseparably tied to the Hebrew Scriptures, not in the way a congregation recites a familiar passage, but in the way a people recognize themselves in a mirror. The Exodus story, a people enslaved in a foreign land crying out to God, led out through a reluctant prophet through a wilderness toward a promised land, was not taught to the enslaved community as a nice religious story. It was lived as biography. Slave narratives collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s are filled with this language. Enslaved men and women described Egypt not as a place in the ancient world, but as the plantation. Pharaoh was the slaveholder, the overseer was the taskmaster, and Canaan, the promised land, was the north, was Canada, was freedom. Frederick Douglass, whose published autobiography remains one of the most important primary sources from this era, wrote explicitly that the enslaved community did not merely relate to the Israelite story, they identified with it, completely, without distance. He wrote, "We were linked to our brethren in bonds of suffering." Now, some historians explain this purely through Christianity, that enslaved Africans adopted the Bible when it was introduced to them by enslavers and found comfort in the Exodus narrative. That is one interpretation, but the documented evidence shows something deeper and more specific. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, a white abolitionist military officer who commanded the first official black regiment in the Civil War, documented in meticulous field notes that the spiritual life of formerly enslaved soldiers was saturated with Israelite self-identification. He wrote that they did not sing about Israel, they sang as Israel. Do you hear the difference? They did not sing about Israel, they sang as Israel. That is not a metaphor, that is a documented claim by a first-hand witness. And then there are the songs, because the songs are where this gets extraordinary. Go Down Moses, you've heard it, you may have sung it in a school choir. But here is what your school choir probably didn't explain. That song was not written as entertainment, it was written as a signal. Researchers and historians, including Dina Epstein in her landmark study, Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, have documented extensively that the spirituals sung on the Underground Railroad served as a dual communication system. On the surface, they were religious hymns, acceptable to white overseers who heard them in the fields. Underneath, they were operational intelligence, and Tubman herself used them this way. Go Down Moses, Let My People Go was not just theology, it was a direct alert. Tubman would send word ahead of a rescue mission through a song left in the fields. The melody meant, prepare, the guide is coming. Wade in the Water, documented by scholars including Giles Oakley and Portia Maltsby, carried a specific directional instruction. Leave the trail, get in the water, the dogs cannot track your scent through a river. Now stop and think about what this means. This community built a complete covert communication system, an entire second language, inside the framework of the Exodus story. That does not happen with a story you borrowed. That happens with a story you own. That happens with a story that is yours. And Tubman, who was illiterate, who never read a map, who navigated by the North Star and by physical landscape, operated entirely inside this framework. She did not adopt Moses as an inspiration. She functioned within the Moses identity as if it were already prepared for her. So I want to ask you directly, does that sound like a metaphor to you? Now let's talk about what the people who actually knew Harriet Tubman said about her, because this is where the primary sources become impossible to ignore. Thomas Garrett was a Quaker station master on the Underground Railroad in Wilmington, Delaware. He helped hundreds of freedom seekers, was prosecuted, fined, and financially ruined for it, and famously told the court he would do it again. His letters are among the most carefully preserved historical documents from this era. In his correspondence, Garrett wrote about Tubman repeatedly, and he did not write about her the way a man describes a brave woman. He wrote about her the way a religious man describes witnessing something he cannot fully explain. He wrote that Harriet had more confidence in the voice of God than most ministers I've ever known. He described her premonitions as consistently accurate. He described moments where she stopped a group mid-journey and said, "Something is wrong at the next safe house. Do not go there. Go this way instead." And she was right. He did not use the word supernatural. He used the word faith. He used the word calling. He used the word Moses. Garrett Smith, the wealthy abolitionist who financed Frederick Douglass's newspaper and funded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, called Harriet the greatest heroine of the age, and specifically compared her to Old Testament figures not as a rhetorical flourish, but as a statement of theological fact. And then there is Douglass himself, who wrote Tubman in 1868, "I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have." But what is less often quoted and more significant for our purposes is the surrounding context in which Douglass and his contemporaries discussed her. In the abolitionist press, in church records, in documented sermons of black ministers across the free North, Tubman was consistently described not as someone who was like Moses, but as someone who was fulfilling a role, a specific, covenant-shaped role. A role that the community understood themselves to belong to a specific kind of person from a specific kind of lineage. And here is the uncomfortable question that historians rarely ask in public. If this community genuinely understood themselves to be the descendants of the Hebrew covenant people, and there is documented evidence built across previous episodes of this channel suggesting exactly that, then calling Harriet Tubman Moses is not poetry, it is prophecy recognized. Now, let's talk about what Harriet Tubman herself said, because this is not a case where later historians projected an identity onto her. This is a case where Tubman wore that identity herself, explicitly, out loud, on the record. Kate Clifford Larson, one of the most rigorous modern biographers of Tubman, documents in Bound for the Promised Land, 2004, that Tubman spoke in explicitly Israelite covenant language throughout her entire life. She did not say, "I am like a guide leading people to safety." She said, "I am going to the Promised Land." She said, "God told me to go." She said, "I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger." During the Civil War, Tubman served as a Union Army spy and scout, and she led the Combahee River Raid in 1863, officially the first military operation in American history to be planned and led by a woman, which freed approximately 700 enslaved people in a single night. 700 people in one night on the river. Journalists and officers who documented the raid described the scene as biblical. They described Tubman standing at the prow of a gunboat directing the operation, while hundreds of people ran from the plantations toward the water, men, women, children, carrying everything they owned, and the observers reached instinctively for the same word, Exodus. General Rufus Saxton, who oversaw Union operations in South Carolina, wrote in his official reports that Tubman's effectiveness relied on two things: her tactical intelligence, which he described as exceptional, and the trust the enslaved population had in her, which he described as the trust a people gives to a prophet, not a spy, not a scout, a prophet. That word was not chosen carelessly. It was chosen by a military officer writing an official government document because it was the most accurate word he could find. Now, I need to slow down here because this is where the video gets important. Everything I have described so far is in the historical record. The primary sources exist. The documents can be verified. Tubman's own words, her contemporaries' testimonies, the theological framework of her community, all of it is documented. And mainstream history presents all of this and then says, and that's why she was called Moses. It was a beautiful metaphor. But here is the question that the evidence itself is pointing toward, if you are willing to follow it to its logical destination. What if the Exodus identity that Tubman's community carried was not a metaphor they adopted from white Christianity? What if it was a memory they preserved from within? As documented in previous episodes of this channel through historical, linguistic, and archaeological evidence, there is a growing and serious scholarly conversation about the ancestral connections between West African communities transported to the Americas and Israelite cultural and covenant identity. We are not going to relitigate that foundation here. Go back and watch those episodes if you haven't. What we are doing in this episode is asking, given that foundation, what do we do with Harriet Tubman? Because if the enslaved African community of 19th century America carried a genuine Israelite identity, not borrowed, not metaphorical, but ancestral, then the language they used was not poetry, it was history, it was lineage, it was covenant memory, speaking through enslaved lips in a hostile land. And Harriet Tubman was not like Moses. She was from the same covenant family. She was doing the same work. She was answering the same call, in a different century, on a different continent, but in the same unbroken story. That is not a small claim, I know that, and I am not asking you to accept it on faith. I am asking you to look at the evidence alongside me and follow it wherever it leads. Here is a single documented moment I want you to hold in your mind. At some point, the exact date is uncertain, Harriet Tubman was asked by an interviewer how she knew when to move, how she knew which routes were safe, how she knew across 13 missions, without maps or written communications, how to get through. She answered, "I never ran my train off the track. I never lost a passenger. And when I knew I couldn't go one step further, I asked God to help me." The journalist pressed her. How did God help her specifically? She said, "He told me where to go." The journalist tried to rationalize this as intuition, as experience, as the practical knowledge of someone who had learned the land over years. And Tubman stopped him. She said, "You don't understand. I wasn't relying on my knowledge. I was relying on His. He has always brought His people through, and I am His people. I am His people, not I am like His people, not I identify with His people, not the story of His people inspires me. I am His people." That is a statement of identity. That is a theological claim. That is a woman telling you in plain documented English that she understood herself not as the imitator of a biblical role, but as the occupant of it. And the question that follows, the question I am leaving in your hands, is this: was she right? Here is what becomes remarkable when you lay out Tubman's full biography through this lens. The parallels between her life and the life of Moses are not loose and general. They are specific, they are structural, they are documented at nearly every point. Moses was born into slavery. Tubman was born into slavery. Moses survived a violent attempt on his life in youth. Tubman survived a near-fatal violent attack as a young girl, the lead weight that fractured her skull. Moses received visions from God that guided his movements. Tubman received visions documented by multiple witnesses and described by her consistently as divine communications that guided every mission she ran. Moses led people out of bondage through a physical journey toward a promised land. Tubman led people through a physical journey, 90 miles at a time, toward what she explicitly, repeatedly, and publicly called the Promised Land. Moses was protected from capture by a series of events that his contemporaries described as miraculous. Tubman escaped capture through a series of events that her contemporaries, including trained military observers, consistently described as inexplicable. Wrong turns by pursuers, bridges flooded at precisely the right moment, hunting dogs that inexplicably lost the trail. Moses eventually shifted from guiding individuals to leading entire communities. Tubman shifted from individual escape missions to commanding the largest single-night liberation in American military history. And Moses, at the end of his life, was promised that his people would inherit their land, but he would not live to see it fully realized. Harriet Tubman lived to see the end of slavery. She lived to see the 13th Amendment. She also lived to see Reconstruction destroyed and the rise of a new system of oppression in its place. She died in 1913, still fighting, still speaking, still calling for her people. She never stopped being Moses, even after the sea had closed. So let me bring this together. What mainstream history gives you is this. Harriet Tubman was an extraordinary woman, courageous and faithful, and she was called Moses because she was like Moses. It was a beautiful nickname for a remarkable life. What the documented evidence actually gives you is something more demanding than that. It gives you a community that did not merely admire the Exodus story, but lived inside it, that coded it into songs, used it to navigate actual physical terrain, and described themselves in their own documented words as the covenant people. It gives you a woman who did not adopt a biblical role, but occupied one, who spoke in covenant language, was described in covenant language by everyone who encountered her, and understood herself in covenant terms from the beginning of her life to the end. And it gives you a structural pattern between the biblical Exodus and the 19th century American freedom movement that is not loose or general, but specific and precise at nearly every point. I am not telling you what to conclude. This channel presents documented evidence, asks documented questions, and invites you to do what historians and investigators are supposed to do: follow the evidence to the most coherent explanation. The most coherent explanation of why Harriet Tubman was called Moses by her contemporaries, abolitionists, military officers, and, most importantly, by herself, is not that it was a poetic comparison. The most coherent explanation is that the people who used that name believed it was accurate. And they believed it was accurate because they understood something about who they were and who she was that the standard history curriculum has never fully explored. Here's the question I want you to sit with. If Black Moses was not a metaphor, but a title, if Harriet Tubman wasn't compared to Moses, but was literally continuing the Exodus story in a different century, then how many other names in American history are actually titles that got reframed as compliments? How many other men and women in the story of enslaved Africans in America were given nicknames that were actually identity statements and then quietly filed away as poetry? I want to know who you're thinking about right now. Drop their name in the comments. Tell me which figure in Black history you think may be carrying a documented identity that history relabeled as metaphor. I will investigate them. I will bring the documented evidence. I will build the case the same way we built it today, from primary sources, from witness testimony, from the words of the people themselves. Because if this story is real, and the evidence says it is, then we are not at the end of the investigation. We are barely at the beginning. If you made it to the end of this video, you already know what most people scrolling past this channel don't. Share this with one person who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next episode.